We did this magnificent audio upgrade in this really beautiful, beautiful 1954 Bentley Continental Type R with Mulliner coachwork. I mean, this is just an incredible example of that car model that was just beautifully restored. I mean, it's darn perfect, this thing. And we were asked to do an audio system in it, but a significant one. And you know, it's not a usual request. Most people don't take cars like that and decide to put a stereo system in them that's of any significance, really. They might want to keep it all stock and just make sure that that's working, but this fellow wanted something really special. He also didn't want to change the car at all. You know, he didn't want to like ruin it or destroy its provenance or affect its value into the future in any way. So that part of it was really the challenge. So step one was to really take a really good examination of the car and poke around, look at it, and trying to determine where things would go and where speakers would go, where amplification would go, where, you know, the parts that we needed to install would go. But also to familiarize ourselves with the construction of it, because it's a very old car. It's essentially handmade in many respects. And this one was really beautifully restored. This was a real concourse quality example of a 54 Bentley. It was nearly perfect. So we sort of gingerly took a look at everything and made some determinations on how we would do something like this. Our decision was to remove parts of the interior, save them, but not just save them. Like, we actually made a wood crate with nested provisions inside the crate to save and preserve every single part we removed. And we removed such parts as the original radio. The original radio had a piece of veneered wood that was attached to it. There were parts of the original glove box that we removed that were underneath the dashboard, and some other things. But every one of those parts was configured inside of a wood crate that we made, buffered the parts with foam, etc., plastic, you know, whatever was needed. We even put a set of instructions inside that would direct somebody as to what these parts were and how you know, you could reverse everything, and left our contact information there as well. And then the crate was sealed up, handles were attached to it, and this was a well-made wooden crate out of like a high-quality birch plywood. We set in a very professionally printed label that had the client's name, VIN number, you know, what it was for, the date it was packaged, and even like a warning to keep it dry. So that was the handling of the parts that we removed to preserve them. In place of those parts, we basically made a set of new parts. And those new parts were carefully designed to look just like the factory. And that there was really the fun part and the challenge. The feature that you see first when you look at the stereo system that we installed is where the original radio had been. It hung underneath the main dashboard panel as a secondary panel where the radio was. So we duplicated that secondary panel with a provision to be a speaker grill instead of a radio placement. And that panel was entirely duplicated with the same veneer, the same matchbooking, the same border detail, etc. And it looks dead spot on the same. And we did a different approach with the mid-range speakers. We did what's called an array, and they're very, very small mid-range speakers. So there's 8 of them, I believe. And they're only less than 2 inches in diameter, quite small. It's actually a favored speaker by a lot of these Bose products that are used on desktops and so forth. It's a really high quality speaker made by Peerless. Each speaker was in a chamber that was sealed to the correct specification. And then we covered it in a grill material made out of wicker. And then we stained that wicker to better match our wood color. It was actually a guitar amplifier grill treatment that we found that looked best in this car. In matching the original radio underhanging dash piece, we first had to make a laminated plywood piece that was the exact same shape and arc. Believe it or not, it has a very subtle arc to it. It's not a flat piece of wood. It actually is arced. So that was first duplicated. And then, the hole for the actual speakers where the grill would actually go was figured. And then that part, along with the original part, was sent to a partner of ours that specializes in really British, vintage British auto wood restoration. And we asked them to really make a perfect copy of the veneering that was done from the original to the new piece that we made. And I think they nailed it. They did a perfect job. Every part of it looks original to what had been there. The color, everything. And then the wicker that we used for the actual grill material really just set it right off. So the new mid-range grill at the center of the dashboard that underhangs is the first thing that you see of our work. Then we had to tackle the tweeters. There really wasn't any place in the dashboard for them. There was nothing that we could sort of replace and put a tweeter in place of it. So the approach was to make a sort of bullet-shaped pod and have it hang under these little clefts at the end of the dash ends. And they would just sort of live under there, be mostly black, and sort of blend in with the rest of the piano black features on the car, like the steering wheel and such like that. Those parts are all piano black, and we decided to paint the tweeters piano black, the tweeter pods, that is, piano black. They are a modern looking part when you see them, but they don't really stand out too much, and I actually think they look quite presentable the way that they are. But those really had to be there, and they're also special tweeters. They have what they call a very large back chamber, so they play very low frequency, and we really wanted that sort of type of speaker there to better pair with the mid-ranges that we chose. For a number of reasons. But I think they look really good right where they are at the ends of the dash. And they fasten to fasteners that were already in place on the car, so we didn't have to drill any holes or modify anything that was there. They just pinned right where we have them, just perfectly. The tweeter pods were designed in CAD first. So I basically drew a rough sketch of what I wanted and described it to my CAD designer, and put the part in situation in the car so she could see where it goes. And together we sort of honed a shape that was pleasing and looked good. And we printed, in paper form, we printed this shape in 2 dimensions, and just laminated that paper to some cardboard just so we could sort of place it there. And that was just sort of part of our process, where before we go to 3D printing and waste that time and material, we like to first print it out on paper, because sometimes that mock-up alone is enough to to satisfy you that you've got a good design. And it's quicker and faster. The mandate from the client was to have a really significant sound system, and that usually means that you want some really strong low frequency to go along with everything else. I mean, you want a really fat sound, and that's definitely what he wanted. So where do you put a subwoofer in a 54 Bentley? Not easily done. So our solution there was to remove the original glove box compartment and basically make an entirely new one. This part sits all behind the dashboard. It's unseen, and it was actually fabricated in two parts. One part was the actual glove box compartment, which housed one woofer and one amplifier. The second part, we need to go back to the mid-range speakers for a moment, because those speakers had their own enclosure, which was attached yet to another chamber that held the second woofer. So there were two rather sort of complex compartments that lived underneath the dashboard. Two totally separate assemblies. One basically attached to the glove box, one basically attached to the underhanging mid-range grille. And those were our two speakers. They were small speakers. I think they were 5¼ inch woofers made by a company called Seos, which is an amazing company. They make this incredible woofer that plays deep, loud, and strong in a very, very small chamber. It's very unique. Not a lot of speakers can perform like this one can. And we put two of them in, and they live underneath the dashboard, firing down at the floor. You could peer your head under the dash, you'd see them. But they're all nestled really tightly up in there, and those are our two woofers. And then the amplifier lived actually on top of the woofer that was part of the glove box compartment. Just one amplifier, and everything was really serviceable. Everything could drop down very easily. Everything was attached to existing hardware. Really perfect. Also in the car, there's no radio. We opted for what's becoming more popular now on older cars that folks want audio equipment in. We're just using a simple Bluetooth receiver. So your phone is your radio, your volume control, everything. It's doing all the work. There's no volume controller. There's no anything except your phone. You pair up to it once, and you're in. The last challenge was the electrical system in the car. The new audio components obviously need electricity to work. Being the age this car is, it used what's called a positive ground battery hookup. So ground within the vehicle is not negative per se. In other words, the body of the car on a modern car is tied to the ground terminal of the battery. It's common. So any metallic part on a modern car is common to the negative terminal of the car's battery. That has been the standard for many, many years now. But when there was less standardization in automobile manufacture, there were car makers that chose to have positive ground battery systems where everything metallic in the car was tied to the positive terminal of the battery. This is somewhat of a formality. It's not insurmountable, but you do have to wire things differently. So the amplifier that we installed, its ground wire has to go directly to the battery's ground terminal. You can't ground it to the metallic part of the car. And there's one subtlety here too. The electronics of today also any metallic chassis parts of it can be, not always, but usually are tied to the ground terminal of that product. So the amplifier in question that we use, the JL Audio amplifier, its metallic parts on its exterior are essentially ground with respect to that part. So hooking up the amplifier correctly in a 54 Bentley, one wants to attach the power wires directly to the battery at those terminals, but you also have to make sure that the exterior of the amplifier doesn't come in contact with any metallic body part in the car, because that would create a dead short right away. So you do have to sort of insulate that and be mindful of the fact that that's a live circuit. And because we need a means of turning the darn thing off, so there is a kill switch. You could view this as a switch that turns the stereo system on, although it does turn on and off with the ignition key. We did wire it that way. But the kill switch is there in case it just needs to be off for any reason whatsoever. And that switch disconnects it from the battery completely via relays and such. And that's just a simple toggle switch located under the dashboard on a simple bracket mounted to a simple fastener that was already there. And that's really the only control that anyone has with the stereo system within the car, except for the phone that you're using to pair up with it. And just to sort of wrap things up and reiterate what I had said at the beginning, this is entirely reversible. The original equipment can go right back in its original place with no marring, scratching, or modifications to have to sort of fix or sew up. This is entirely reversible. And the gear that was removed from the car was very carefully preserved in a specially made crate just for it, labeled, etc., so the client can properly store it and care for it, etc. So this is a completely reversible action that we did.